Awesome. Thanks, Kathleen. And I am thrilled to introduce our speaker tonight. So please join me in welcoming our guest, Kayleigh Filkins. Kayleigh is a graduate student at SUNY Brockport doing her master's work on American woodcock habitat selection during the breeding season, which is right now. She did her bachelor's degree in wildlife science at SUNY Environmental Science and Forestry and worked on tick disease after graduating before returning to her passion for birds. I also want to let you know we do have a dedicated Q&A session towards the end of the discussion tonight, so make sure to jot down your questions if they come up along the way. You can also input them into the Q&A, which is different from the chat. It's available at the bottom of your screen. That can be a nice placeholder if you don't want to lose it. So with that, we'll pass it over to Kayleigh.
Thank you. Let me just share my screen really fast. Can everybody see that all right?
Yes, yes.
Perfect. Okay. So like they said with that lovely introduction, my name is Kayleigh Filkins and I am a master's student at SUNY Brockport working on woodcock. So I'm just going to go through a brief presentation outline. I'm going to start by kind of introducing myself again. Mariah did a really good job with that. And then we'll talk about what is a timberdoodle. We'll go through general biology, their range and habitat, and current population trends. And then I'll introduce the Eastern Woodcock Migration Research Collective, why they started, what they do, and then I'll finish up by talking about my work and what New York is interested in. So, like she said, I'm originally from Schenectady, New York, and I got my bachelor's degree in wildlife science from SUNY ESF in 2021. And then I spent a year working on tick and tick-borne disease at SUNY Upstate Medical before I decided I actually like birds a lot better than ticks and decided to go back to get my graduate degree at SUNY Brockport. And another fun fact about me, I'm a volunteer bird bander and a part-time dog trainer. So I spend a lot of time around birds, a lot of time around animals. So the question of the hour is, what is a timberdoodle? And when I teach people about what these birds are, I always start by letting the bird introduce itself. So this is a male woodcock doing its call called a peent, P-E-N-T. It's the mating call for the breeding season. Only males make this vocalization. They start around sunset. So if you're interested in hearing this, you find their habitat around sunset. And it attracts the male or the females out from under the brush to hopefully come mate with them. And they do this prior to their sky dance, which I'll talk about a little bit more later. Literally the cutest noise I've ever heard. The other thing that woodcock are known for is their funky little dance that they do that looks a little bit like this. There's two trains of thought as to what the birds are doing when they walk like this. The first is that they're feeling the soil and loosening it up to make it easier for them to probe for worms and other invertebrates that make up their diet. The other thought is that when they walk like that, it's for predator deterrence, because if let's say a hawk is watching them and they see something scurrying, they'll say, ah, yes, prey. But if they see that, they might be like, oh, what's that? Don't know. I'm going to avoid that. It looks sickly because they have this weird jerky movement. So a woodcock is a bird that has many, many names. Their scientific name is Sculopax minor. They're also known as American woodcock, timberdoodle, bog suckers, whippoorwills, Labrador twisters, night partridge, brush snipe, and so much more. And for the duration of this, I will call them American woodcock just because that's their official name rather than timberdoodle, but that is a very cute nickname for them. So the American woodcock is a member of the order Chiradiformes, which includes plovers, sandpipers, and gulls, also the auks for anyone who knows what those are. And I have examples of those to the right here. They're a member of the family Scolopacidae, which are commonly referred to as the sandpipers, and their most closely related genera are the snipes. So, for example, the Wilson snipe. And this is just a comparison of the woodcock to the Wilson snipe. I took this screenshot from All About Birds, which is a website run by the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. If you ever have any information you want to learn about any bird, I recommend checking this out. It's full of all sorts of cool facts. But if you look at the woodcock next to the Wilson snipe, the woodcock is actually a little bit bigger, which is hard to tell from these photos, a little bit chunkier, a more rufous red color, buffy color, rather than the paler color of the snipe. The woodcock's eyes are very far back on their head and very large. And one fun fact about the woodcock is their brain is actually upside down because their eyes are so far back on their head and their skull is shaped this way. This is so they can check for predators while they're probing in the soil, which is something I learned when I was putting this presentation together. So some of the key characteristics of what a woodcock is, they're crepuscular, which means they're active at dusk and dawn. Think like a white-tailed deer, most active at dusk and dawn. They're migratory, so they don't stay stationary for the entirety of their annual cycle. They're considered a shorebird. However, unlike every other shorebird, they're actually an upland species. So they spend the most of their time away from those shore areas that would traditionally make it a shorebird. And they're also a game bird, which means they're hunted and they're hunted across the entirety of their range. And they're known for the peent, which we listened to earlier, and their sky dance mating display. So this looks like this. They start in one spot on the ground and will fly up to about 300 feet in the air, spin around a little bit, and slowly work their way back down and land in the same spot where they started. This is to attract the females, show them how strong they are, that they can fly that high, and hopefully get them a mate. And this is just a quote from Aldo Leopold about how interesting the sky dance is. One unique thing about their sky dance mating display is their wings will whistle while they're flying. And this is because of these first three primaries, which is part of the flight feathers on a bird. They're uniquely small and thin and have curvature in them, which allows them to whistle. And because of this, they are the slowest flying bird in North America, but I think they can get away with that. And I'm just going to play a soundbite of what the wing whistle sounds like. And what's interesting about this is if you listen to them enough times, you can tell whereabouts in the sky the bird might be based on which part of the wing whistle you're listening to. And then they have these little popping cheep calls that they make as they're landing. So the diet of a woodcock, I previously mentioned, it's primarily earthworms, but they also do eat other soil invertebrates, especially because earthworms are invasive. They had to eat something before they got here. And they use their uniquely long and flexible bill for probe for food in the moist soil. So moist soil is incredibly important to woodcock habitat. And they're polygynous, which means that one male may mate with several females, and then the females become a single mother. They take care of their young alone, including building the nest, incubating the eggs, and feeding the young. The young woodcock will stay with the mother for about a month before they disperse off on their own to be a little young woodcock individual in the world. And I say that the females build the nest, but their nest isn't much of a nest. It's a shallow depression in the ground and leaf litter. So they just kind of scrape a little spot and plop their eggs on the ground, which makes this coloration for them incredibly important because it helps hide them in that brush. And this is just another example of a close-up of a woodcock nest. They lay 1 to 5 eggs per clutch, and a clutch is just how many eggs they lay at a time. And they do sometimes have more than one nest per season. This usually happens if a first nest attempt fails. So if their eggs get eaten, their babies don't survive, they're more likely to do a second one. But because their young stay with them so long, it doesn't always happen. So the range of the woodcock is all eastern United States. As you can see, I'm in New York and also Massachusetts. They're only here during the breeding season, which starts mid-April usually. They've been coming a little bit earlier, mid-March, and goes until about October when they leave. And then year-round, they're sort of in the upper southern area, and then non-breeding season, they're in the tip of Florida, maybe parts of Texas, but they don't really go into Western New York at all. So here's a diagram just quickly describing their habitat. So to start with most open to least open, males require open fields or forests for their display because they're flying, 300 feet in the air. They need to be able to clear that ground. And they may also roost in these areas and along edges to young forest. And all woodcock, regardless of sex, prefer young forests with shorter trees and more shrubs. This is really important, especially for nesting, because they need that to be able to be covered while they're roosting and nesting. If they go into some of these more mature forests, there's not a lot of undergrowth and there's not really any place for woodcock to hide. So they need adequate coverage to hide their nests on the ground. And this is just an example that I like to show people when I talk about woodcock habitat, Three Rivers Wildlife Management Area in Syracuse, New York. I personally think this is the best place to see woodcock. I was there last week and we heard at least 6 or 7, so it's really cool to go there. You can see up front in the picture, there's a lot of brushy area next to a pond, and that pond allows for those soils to be really moist. Towards the back of the picture, there's a younger forest where they'll roost along the edges. In general, population trends for woodcock are declining. So this is broken into central and eastern region. These are just management regions that makes it easier for woodcock populations to be managed. Instead of doing all of them at once, they're kind of split in half. And if you look at the green arrow, that's just a sliver of Minnesota, and that's the only spot where their populations are actively increasing. Everywhere else in their range, it's going down. And I'm just going to point out again that they are migratory. And this is important coming up. So what we know is information about breeding season and wintering and some of the declines that are going on there. A lot of previous woodcock studies are focused on short-range radio telemetry and band returns, so we know what they're doing when they're sitting still, but what we don't really know is what they're doing during fall and spring migration and how threats during migration may contribute to these population declines. So that's where the Eastern Woodcock Migration Research Collective comes in. It was started in 2017 by the University of Maine to try and answer some of these questions about what's going on with a woodcock during their migration. So there are a lot of people that are involved with the EWMRC. There's cooperators and coordinators. Cooperators are state agencies like the DEC, Environment and Climate Change Canada, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, U.S. Geological Survey, National Wildlife Refuges, and NGOs. And they do all the sort of logistical stuff like finding funding for transmitter purchases and Argos data fees. And Argos is just the name of the satellite that our transmitters use specifically. And they spearhead local capture efforts, so site prep, scouting, captures, and they consult on study designs and implementation. Now, the coordinators are primarily the University of Maine and the University of Rhode Island, but other places like me at SUNY Brockport are considered coordinators. So we coordinate all the permitting logistics, capture logistics, purchasing of these units. And we manage the project databases, so all of the data downloads and the MoveBank repository, which MoveBank is just an online interface where every collaborator can look at the transmitter data at once. So we don't have to worry about having to share it with each other, wait for emails to come back. We get live updates for the transmitters all at once. And we're here to communicate results in advanced science. There's a lot of graduate students, both PhD and masters, who work on this. And we've had a lot of papers coming out of the EWMRC. And we try to make our cooperators' life easier because they have a lot going on. So a lot of it falls on us to try to figure out this specific project. So there's a few questions that the EWMRC is trying to answer. The first is timing of migration. So when and why do woodcock migrate when they do? What triggers them to leave when they do? What do they need in order to be able to leave? And are there differences in strategies based on individual traits? So sex, age, location. Like, are younger birds going to wait longer? Are females going to leave first? Those kinds of questions. The second is habitat management planning. So where are the important stopover areas and migration corridors? And how do we prioritize habitat management for those areas? As we might find that, oh, along the corridors, there's not enough resource, so they aren't able to finish their migration. And the final one is relevance to woodcock populations. So what is the mortality risk during migration? Where and when can we find these threats? How can we mitigate these threats? And how does migration relate to reproduction? Is there something that's going on during migration that prevents woodcock from reproducing or vice versa? So this is information from fall migration from 2018 to 2019, I believe. So the average woodcock spent 22 days migrating, but this ranged from anywhere from 1 to 72 days. And they had an average of 4.2 stops, so the range from 0 to 11 stops. And they had an average stopover length of 4.85 days with a range from 1 to 21 days. And the total distance average was 911 miles, but they went anywhere from 19 to 2,023 miles. So as you can see, there is a huge variation in the amount of time a woodcock will spend migrating. And this was for their fall migration. Spring was very similar, but more prolonged. So how do we get this information? What we use is low-tech pinpoint 120 GPS transmitters. What's cool about them is they're programmable, so we can build custom location schedules per bird. So we had one graduate student who was working on nesting, so he could take more points during the breeding season, where some people working on migration may prolong the schedule so they get more points out of each transmitter. They're also rechargeable, so they can be used if they're recovered. They are designed to fall off of the bird. However, recovery can be a little bit difficult just because once they die, we don't exactly know where they're going to be. So once we put them on a bird, the GPS satellites will find the location of the bird, send it to our satellite operator, which was the Argo satellite I mentioned, and then the GPS locations get sent to us, so we can get this in real time. So my favorite part of talking about what I do is, well, how do you catch a woodcock? And there are two primary ways that we go about doing this. The first is thermal cameras and hand nets. So this is a forward-looking infrared camera called a FLIR, and this is a hand net called the Chicken Catcher 5000, which is not a joke. That is the exact one that we used. So we'll have one person with a FLIR unit looking for what we hope is a woodcock in a field, and we'll creep towards it and strobe it with a floodlight in order to disorient it, while another person hand nets the bird and hopefully catches it. So this is just an example of what it looks like through a thermal camera. There is a woodcock right there. And I'll let you know now that there are a lot of woodcock-shaped rocks in the world, and we got ourselves confused quite frequently. But when we find the birds like this, we'll go over, like in this picture, and we'll drop the net on them. And this is my favorite picture I've ever taken of a woodcock through the thermal camera. You can see its little beak and his little head sticking out of the brush there. So sometimes they do look like a woodcock through the camera. The second technique is using mist nets. So mist nets are just thin black nets that you stretch across the landscape. And the idea is that the birds won't see it when it's flying. So we'll play an audio lure of a male painting primarily for breeding season, we want to catch females. So the female might hear this and be like, whoa, that's a good sounding male. Let me go check that out and fly into the net. We also have caught males this way because they're like, hey, boy, you're in my territory, and try to go attack the other woodcock. And when they get caught in the net, it tangles up their feathers. So the birds aren't hurt while they're in the net. It just secures their feathers so they can't fly away. And everyone who extracts them from the net are trained professionals. So there's no injury to the bird while they're in the net. Once we have the birds in hand, we take the age and the sex of the bird. We weigh them, which is the most important thing we'll do because the transmitters can only be 3% or less of the bird's body weight. So we need to make sure that they're heavy enough to carry the transmitters without it hindering their ability to walk, fly, forage, basically live its life. We want it to be as unnoticeable to the bird as possible. We take its bill length, the tarsus length, which is just the lower segment of the bird's leg, and the wing chord, which is basically wrist to fingertips. We take the wrist joint all the way to the longest primary flight feather and how long that is. Every bird that we catch gets an aluminum U.S. Geological Society bird band, and all of this information that we take for the bird is uploaded so people who have access to bird banding data can use it later on. And then, like I said, only transmitters will go on birds that are heavy enough to carry them. So these are some of the field photos that I have taken in the past. The one on the left is just a picture of a bird's wing that I took so that I could age it once I got home because I couldn't quite tell. And then on the lower right is just a bird with its transmitter on. These are rump mounted, so the little loops go around their legs and sit on their lower back, so it doesn't hinder their ability to fly at all. It doesn't go near their wings. And the top right picture is us attaching one of these transmitters to the bird. And once we attach the transmitter, we'll make sure that it can walk just fine. We'll set it down and we'll watch it to make sure it flies off. And if for some reason it can't, we'll just recatch it and we'll make sure everything is all right with the bird. So we have all this information. What do we do now? So from these data, or from these transmitters, the data we can get is the timing of departure, the distance of their flight, the locations of length and stopovers, their migration path, and their destination, either in their summering or wintering areas. So this is just an example of some birds that were caught in Maine in 2017. You can see that that one bluebird went from northern Maine all the way down to Georgia for its migration path, where the one that's kind of a pink color went basically from the same spot only to New York. And some of these birds have a lot of points during their migration and some don't. So it's cool to see all of the variability that these birds do during their migration and the kind of how they all make their choices. And because this is the Berkshire Natural Resources Council, I made a map of all of the bird locations in Massachusetts from 2017 to sometime last week when I made this map. There are 308 locations for birds that were in Massachusetts. So they seem to like that kind of middle section, and then over in Cape Cod seems to be a lot of points. So from 2017 to spring of 2023, we've put out 596 GPS transmitters on woodcock captured in 15 states and 3 Canadian provinces. These provided data on 517 migration attempts and 405 full migratory paths. And we can use all of this to gather all sorts of information. So like I previously mentioned, we have quite a few graduate students working on analyzing all of this. So, for example, Dr. Alex Fish at the University of Maine worked on migration phenology, so when and why a bird might start to migrate. Dr. Sarah Clemens at the University of Maine, she's in the process of publishing a paper about migration strategies and migration survival for these birds. Colby Slezak down at the University of Rhode Island just published a paper about sex-specific trends and habitat selection in Rhode Island specifically. Liam Berrigan at the University of Maine is working on distribution of flight locations during migration. Rachel Darling at the University of Maine is working on light pollution and genomic population connectivity. And then I specifically am working on landscape use in New York State. And that is just a small subset of all of the things that the EWMRC has going on. Towards the end, I have a link to the EWMRC website, and every year we put out a yearly report. So if people are interested in reading what kind of stuff we have going on, I definitely recommend checking that out. So now for the last kind of section, I'm going to talk about what I'm doing in New York State. So New York State Department of Environmental Conservation has been involved with the EWMRC since it started. We've had transmitters go out in New York since the beginning, but recently they wanted to expand their focus on the breeding season. So a lot of the previous transmitters went out right before migration, so they didn't get to see exactly what the birds were doing during breeding. So they invested in me, the graduate student, to do this work. And we recently, in the past 2 years, so 2022 and 2023, put 20 additional transmitters out during the breeding season, which is again from April-ish to October. So we put the transmitters out at the end of April. And I'm focusing on the habitat management planning question that the WMRC has. So rather than migration corridors and stopover areas, I'm focusing on their breeding area and how we can prioritize habitat management for breeding. And this is a part of the New York State DEC's Young Forest Initiative. So birds like the woodcock and the eastern whippoorwill, other animals like the eastern cottontail, require this young forest habitat, which I talked about during the woodcock habitat section. These wildlife require areas that have disturbances to keep things younger and shorter and not fill into mature forest that doesn't have the underbrush that they need to be protected and the food that they need. And right now, a lot of areas are being managed for more mature forests, so they want to focus on creating this more young forest habitat. I believe there's a goal of at least 30% of forests being considered young. So the first question I asked to answer what are the woodcock doing during breeding season is how much area does a bird use? So what I can do is I can take a select number of points from an individual bird's locations. And what I'll do is I put them into ArcGIS and R. So ArcGIS is the software used for just spatial analysis, so I can plot the points on a map, see exactly where the birds are. And R is a statistical software, which I can use to run some fancy math so I don't have to. And I plug them into both of these, which if anyone's interested in exactly what I do, feel free to ask, but it is complicated math that I won't be getting into if no one wants to hear about it. And I can formulate what we call home ranges. So they take the bird points, fancy math, it'll show me exactly what they considered birds are using. So this is an example of a spot in New York State where I can plot the bird points directly onto a map, run it through R, and it'll give me this home range. So this is the area that I'm considering the bird had used. And what I can do with this is plot a land cover map. So this is the Nature Conservancy terrestrial habitat map. And this just shows me what different land cover classifications are. So for example, that dark green, I believe is coniferous forest, where that pale pinkish color is agricultural land. And using this, I can determine whether there's a certain land cover type that birds like more than others. And I can do this by running a resource selection function. So this is just a way to test what landscape features woodcock both like and dislike. And this is done using woodcock locations and generated random points. So if you look at the little clip art thing I made there, if red is a bird point and black is a random point, I can run it through R, fancy math, and it will tell me whether or not there's a preference in either direction. So if you just look at this really quick, there's a lot of red points in that green, but not a lot in the gray. So what the program might tell me is, oh, birds select for that green habitat, but against the gray habitat. And I can use this to inform some of my conclusions later on. And I can do this with all sorts of things. So some of the landscape features of interest for me is the land cover type, distance to water, distance to roads, elevation, and slope. And elevation and slope can be used to help aid questions about soil moisture. So what I've found so far, so I have males next to females right here. Everything to the right of that red line going down the middle means the birds like it and they're selecting for it. They're using it more in proportion to what's available on the landscape, where everything to the left, they dislike. They're selecting against it. They aren't using it in proportion to what's available on the landscape. Now, anything in that's touching that red line, whether it's the error bars or the point itself, means they're just using it as like what's available. They're not selecting for, they're not selecting against. So what this shows so far is males seem to like wet meadow and shrubland and wet forest, and females seem to like emergent marshes, and they both are avoiding agriculture and open water. So this is just photos of what the birds do like, that grassy, shrubby, wet areas. And as we could probably suspect without fancy math, is that they don't like agriculture, open water, or these highly developed areas. So what can I do with this information? Well, by understanding what characteristics of the landscape that woodcock like, I'm going to build a tool that will help managers locate areas where woodcock are more likely to be found so they can protect those areas and continue to manage it to have the resources that the birds need. And then they can inversely find areas that are lacking in resources and manage for those resources in the hopes that it will create more breeding habitat, which will hopefully lead to more successful nests and hopefully lead to an increasing population rather than a decreasing population. So I've already touched on land cover type, but like I said, I'm going to be expanding my model to be a little bit more complicated to include distance to roads, distance to water, soil moisture, elevation, slope. And because I am part of the EWMRC, the Migration Collective, I'm going to run a similar analysis using those stopover locations to see if perhaps New York could use some better stopover sites, especially because we're located sort of in the middle of a lot of the birds' migration path. It is important that we have good spots for them to stop and recharge. So I just want to thank everybody at the Berkshire Natural Resources Council for inviting me to do this. And my advisor, Dr. Jake Straub, for helping me put this together. My thesis committee, Josh Stiller and Dr. Kristen Malone. All of my lab members, volunteers, and the DEC biologists who put the transmitters out because it was not easy and it was a lot of long nights. Then again, thanking all my collaborators, so the Blomberg Lab at the University of Maine, the University of Rhode Island, Colby Slezak, for answering all of the questions I had about everything going on with the EWMRC. And just thank everybody for coming and listening. This is my email if after the Q&A you come up with something else, or if you want help finding a woodcock in your area, happy to help. And then this is the EWMRC website, which I recommend everyone go and look at because there's a lot of cool information.
Thank you so much, Kayleigh. That was really interesting, and I have a whole new appreciation for woodcocks besides just their cuteness now. So we'll open it up to questions. Feel free to put your questions in the chat or in the Q&A button that you'll find at the bottom of the screen. We can start. Let's see if there's anything in the chat yet. Not yet. I know that Mariah and I have a few questions. So I'll just start with one of ours. Are there community science actions that the public can do to support woodcock research? For example, recording observations on eBird or something like that?
Yeah, I know some of the other people are using eBird data, so it always helps. Most places do also have singing ground surveys. I don't know if all of them are always open to the public, but the more people listening for them, the better. A lot of our population data comes from those singing ground surveys, and that's how we know that they're in the decline. So, depending on the area, I recommend looking up if that's an option because there are a lot of routes, and I know I've been asked to help for them, so I'm sure other people would appreciate it.
Awesome. Thanks so much. I'll also do a shout out to the Merlin app for folks who are novice birders like myself to help identify. There's a great sound ID feature. And I've been able to confirm hearing woodcock at my house because of that. We'll send those apps around too in a follow-up. One question I had, and I feel like you've touched on it in some ways, but I'm just curious about, climate change is a big factor going on, and I just wondered if there are any intersectionalities about, what woodcocks might be facing in terms of habitat loss or anything like that related to either happening now or expected to happen because of climate change.
Yeah. I mean, climate change affects a lot of things, not just woodcock, but a lot of birds have been migrating sooner than they perhaps wanted to. So they get up here and they're like, oh, wait, the ground's still frozen. I thought it was warm enough to leave. So that's why a lot of the phenology research is really important. And then, of course, climate change affecting how habitat is made up will affect woodcock in the long run. They like a lot of patchy areas, so if a lot of these things can't grow anymore because it's too hot or they grow too fast and die too fast, it can have a negative impact.
You. Not seeing any. Oh, looks like there's something that came in on the Q&A. So Mark is asking, are you seeing land managers, public or private, who are interested in promoting woodcock habitat?
Yeah, so the entire DEC is interested in promoting the woodcock habitat. A lot of people I've talked to just in general, they want to see the bird. It's a very popular, charismatic bird. Plus, they are considered an umbrella species. So if we manage for woodcock, it'll help for a lot of other things. The Young Forest Initiative, I actually have a coworker who's working on whippoorwill research, and we found that they use, slightly similar habitat types. So for managing for one helps the others, which is what the Young Forest Initiative is about. So a lot of land managers are like, well, if the woodcock are there, it's promising for all of these other species, especially because the woodcock, like, it's considered mosaic, so it's really patchy. So forest here, open field here, forest here. So they like that unique makeup, which helps other things.
Awesome. Thank you so much. We did have another question come into the chat. Can you remind us why their wings whistle again?
Yeah, I can go all the way back to that slide.
That was such a cool fact. I
It's, it's
never
very
would have
cool.
thought.
So they have, we'll get there. Their flight feathers are called the primaries. They're the first like 9 or 10 wing or feathers on a bird. Um, yeah, we'll get there. So these ones, so they're smaller and they have a distinct curve shape in them, which when they flap, the wind flies through them and it causes the whistling to happen, which again, because these are the flight feathers, but these ones are so much smaller, it makes them a very, very slow flyer, which makes their cryptic coloration really important. Which, fun fact about this too, by measuring these, you can tell the difference between a male and a female bird.
Thanks. Let's see if there are any other questions in the chat. I will ask you one of our questions. So um, we are wondering what the main predators of American woodcocks are.
That is a good question. Ground dwelling animals like raccoons will eat the eggs, possums will eat the eggs, coyotes, foxes, almost anything that will eat a ground dwelling animal will eat a woodcock. I'd assume owls can also get them. because they're out at the same time, but a lot of those mesocarnivores.
I
And I guess
imagine,
people technically, but they're not
right.
hunted all that much and they're pretty small, so I don't get why people would hunt them in general, but that's just my opinion.
Mm-hmm. I imagine that their nests being on the ground is a vulnerability from human impact and
Yes.
other predators. Yeah.
Yeah, especially because one of the things I've heard everyone who's interacted with a woodcock say is, "Oh, I've accidentally kicked him off the ground because I didn't see him." It's the
Oh,
likelihood of things stepping on the, yeah, but that's why that brushy stuff is important so they can kind of tuck themselves away and hopefully reduce that happening.
Interesting. Yeah, kind of. I know that a lot of folks really strive for like a clean backyard, like a clean forest. And I know the impulse with a big storm, we just had a lot of wood came down in my backyard, and I'm like, it's good to leave it, it doesn't
yeah.
have to be clean. We have a number of questions coming into the chat and the Q&A. So I'll go ahead and ask this one. Let's see. Are there particular plants that woodcocks prefer?
Not that I know of off of the top of my head. I'm also doing a pretty large scale study, so I don't look at the specific makeup of the things. So I don't actually know off the top of my head.
No worries. Um, all right, Charlotte, I'll pass it over to you.
Okay. Let's see. So we have a question from Gunnar. Since woodcocks depend on young and disturbed forests, are there commercial forestry practices that might contribute to their conservation? And do you know if anyone is practicing those? Great question.
I don't actually know enough about forestry practices to know whether that's true. I know New York is a very forested, like timbered area. And part of the reason a lot of mature forest is made up how it is because of that. So I think in reverse, a lot of the sort of timber industry might reduce the amount of woodcock habitat rather than increase it.
I'm remembering, and Charlotte, maybe you can help me. I think there's definitely a forestry for the birds program. I think it's through Mass Audubon or the New England Forestry Foundation. I'm not 100% sure, but we could do a little research and send that around.
Yeah, I have a pamphlet somewhere in my house about
Yes.
that program. So I'll see if I can dig it up.
Awesome. So a question from Kim. Do males keep those whistling primaries all year or just for breeding?
All year.
All year. All right.
Yep.
Um, Question from Robert. How high do woodcocks fly during migration?
That's a good question. So our transmitters can technically read the altitude. How accurate those are, I don't know. I've seen anywhere from like, 50 to 100 feet up to like 600. So the actual answer, I don't know. It's pretty variable. I know they go up to 300 during their mating display, so they can get up pretty high, but
Yeah, when I've watched their display before, I lose them in my field
yes.
of vision at some point. It's wild. You no longer see them
Yeah.
until I'm diving back down.
Yeah, like
Amazing.
I mentioned with the like wing whistling, once you've seen it enough, you can kind of figure out where they are based on what you're hearing. But that takes a lot of nights just sitting in a field watching them, which I do. But
Interesting. I'll pass it off to you, Maria.
All right. So Carolyn asked if hunting woodcock are allowed in Massachusetts and other states, and if so, how is it managed? I'll pass it to you, Kayleigh, and happy to support the answer if helpful.
yeah. They are hunted in most states. I don't actually know any states off the top of my head where they aren't. They have a decently short, it's like a month-long hunting window, at least in New York. But a lot of previous studies have shown that hunting woodcock doesn't actually affect their population either way because it happens so little and not enough of them are harvested. So it doesn't need to be that strictly managed unless people all decide suddenly they want to be eating woodcock every night, which why would you? Um, so
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, I did look up Mass Wildlife's website has some information about that hunting season and other, see what they designated them as migratory game birds. So woodcock, snipe, coot, and rails all fall into that category. I do have another question if no one else has a question. You had mentioned that they're an umbrella species, and I think you mentioned at least one other bird that kind of rely on that young forest habitat. Could you share just a couple other species that also rely on that? I think it's a really interesting fact.
Yeah, so a lot of warblers do. The exact warblers are escaping my brain right now because there are so many. And then in terms of mammals, like Eastern cottontail do. There are a few more, which again are escaping my brain right now because I think in bird. But a lot of warblers, the whippoorwills, which are another really cool one. The golden winged warbler, that's one of them. So yeah, a lot of the things like that.
Great.
We got another question in the Q&A. Let's see. I think I've heard that woodcock eat earthworms. Do they eat jumping worms? And what else do they eat? They eat. Mark missed the first half of the talk.
Yeah, so they eat primarily earthworms. A lot of woodcock studies that go into that sort of stuff focus on the earthworm part, whether they eat jumping worms. I don't know off the top of my head, maybe in parts of the area where they're available, they're not exactly picky. It just happens to be that earthworms are ubiquitous. There are a lot, they eat, most soil invertebrates that they can find. They caught some out in the Albany pine bush where it was really sandy and dry, so there weren't as many earthworms, and they ate whatever they could find there. So if jumping worms are available to them, I don't see why they wouldn't.
Right. And one other question. Let's see here. You said that you could sex them based on the thin primaries. Do the female wings ever make noise?
They do when they fly away, which, when I kick them up when I'm trying to catch them, I hear the of them leaving me behind. So yes, they do. They're only a little bit thicker on the females. I am a little bit curious myself why the females have this characteristic. If they don't need it for the display, it just makes them slow at flying. But yeah, they do.